Today we're talking about the bad boy of Russian literature, the manipulative narcissist, an overall terrible man, the protagonist of the hero of our time, Grigory Pechorin. Or was I talking about the author? Russian authors and writers have always had a complicated relationship with their government and censors. For instance, the best poet that Russia has ever known, Alexander Pushkin, was in constant conflict with the newly crowned Tsar Nikolai I, who believed Pushkin to be, if not an open collaborator in the Decembrist revolt, but at least a terrible influence on the masses. He called him the leader of free thinkers. How dare he think freely, and in Russia too. Nikolai quickly realized the influence that the writers had in the court of public opinion, especially in the 19th century, so he felt quite threatened by Pushkin's popularity. When Pushkin died in a duel with Dantes, the country, or at the very least St. Petersburg, fell into deep mourning. People were gathered in masses near Pushkin's apartment in the days before his passing and even after. According to some legends, Ivan Turgenev, the future writer, was in hysterics and made somebody bring him a lock of Pushkin's hair to keep as a memento. We still have that lock of hair in Turgenev Museum, actually. Russia mourns the loss of its greatest writer. Quite a big church was selected in order for people to come and pay their respects and farewells to the fallen author, but at the last minute Nikolai made them change it to a small chapel so only close family and friends could come. Nikolai was petty that way. But at the same time, a poem was spreading around St. Petersburg. A young officer, Mikhail Lermontov, who's never met Pushkin actually, but felt quite connected to him, wrote these powerful lines. A poet's dead, entrapped by honor, felled by the slunges from a spread, a bullet in the breast with vengeful anger, he bowed at last his noble head. His soul could not endure the legions of strifen insults and their shame. He stood against the world's opinions, alone, as always, and was slain. Yes, slain! And wherefore now the crying, the praising choir's empty shout, and wretched babbles justifying fate's sentence has been carried out. Was it not you who long conspired to mock his gifts so free and bold, and just for fun to fan the fire whose embers were not growing cold? Nikolai didn't like that, especially these last 16 lines, but I think the whole poem in general was quite poignant. And so, by the Tsar's decree, the 23-year-old Mikhail Lermontov was exiled south to the Caucasus Mountains to continue his military service there, and one would assume to think on his behavior. Mikhail Lermontov is the second best poet Russia has to offer. He and Alexander Pushkin have set the bar so high so that it would take a couple of decades for anybody to come even close. We call the early 19th century the golden age of Russian literature, and especially poetry, and that's thanks to these two. Lermontov lived an even shorter life than Pushkin, but still left a significant legacy. Lermontov was born 15th of October 1814 here in Moscow. His father's line goes back to the Scottish name of Lermont. Some even claim that he's related to the famous Thomas Lermont, although obviously there is no proof. On the mother's side, his grandmother came from the famous Stolypin family, which would affect Lermontov's life quite a bit, since his mother died soon after giving birth, and the grandmother then took control of her only grandson, pushing the father, Yuri, aside. In essence, she bought Mikhail off of his father, since the father did not have the same resources to provide for his son as the grandmother did, so she stipulated in her will that Mikhail would only get her inheritance if he stayed with her, with limited visits from the father. The relationship between the father and the grandmother grew worse and worse as the years went by, and so, for all intents and purposes, when Lermontov came of age, he had to choose between his grandmother and his father, and he chose his grandma. The decision wasn't as clear-cut as one would think. This motif of complicated choices, the troubled relationships, and the betrayal, this would all appear in Lermontov's poetry. And as history shows, it was all extra pointless because the grandma outlived her grandson. Not by much, but still. On the flip side of this Sophie's choice and the sheer toxicity of putting the boy in a position like this, the grandma doted on him. His childhood was spent in the family estate of Tarhane with the best tutors money could buy and the prettiest governesses for his pleasure. And when the time came for him to get a proper education, the grandma moved them to Moscow for Lermontov to attend the lycée and the Moscow University. After 2 years in Moscow University, Lermontov had to leave under unknown circumstances. We don't know why he had to do that. And so he moved to St. Petersburg, but St. Petersburg Uni wouldn't accept Moscow Uni credits, so they wanted Lermontov to start his education over, so he abandoned this path and went into military instead. St. Petersburg life for Lermontov was a social life spent in the high society, living the life of a young bachelor, if you know what I mean. Lermontov's love life was not particularly successful. There were some really questionable affairs, and about the only true love of his was probably a woman called Varvara Lopukhina, who loved him as well, but Lermontov wasn't good enough match for her, so she had to marry another. She remained his friend and confidant, though. And his love affairs, successful or otherwise, obviously fed into his poetry. Lermontov started writing early, some of it naive, brought on by the first teenage heartbreaks, some of it quite naughty and filthy, as you would expect in all-male uni and then military quarters, but for Lermontov, poetry was still just a hobby. Literature at the time wasn't considered serious. Even Pushkin's influence hasn't gone that far, so it wasn't cool to be writing poetry. A more appropriate hobby for a gentleman of the time was something like music or painting, something that Lermontov also dabbled in. And by doubled in, I mean these are gorgeous paintings by Lermontov from later in his life during his Caucasus exiles, and they are quite stunning, really. But as I've said already, the fame came to Lermontov with the death of the poet, 1837, and his subsequent exile to the Caucasus, but the public now knew who Lermontov was. The first exile was an easy one. Grandma pulled all of the strings that she possibly could to keep Lermontov away from the front lines of the Caucasus War. So this exile for him was all about the beauty of the Caucasus Mountains and the people that he encountered there. All of that not only fed into his paintings, but it also affected his worldview, which in turn also fed into his poetry. The famous poems from that time are Demon and Mtsiri, both depicting the loneliness of man surrounded by the hostile world, both perfect examples of the Romantic period. Lermontov was allowed to return to the capital relatively quickly, to the society that knew him now. Not only did he enjoy the society life, but he continued to write. His only prosaic novel, Hero of Our Time, was published in the period of 1838 through 1840. Unfortunately, his return to St. Petersburg was short-lived as well. Due to a duel with the French ambassador's son Barant, 1840, Lermontov was sent to the Caucasus once again. This time, he was sent to the front lines of the Caucasus War. The first exile was a walk in the park compared to this one, though. During the brief leave in St. Petersburg in the winter of 1840-1841, Lermontov was already considering leaving the military behind and focusing on literature. However, that was not meant to be. As he traveled back south, he stayed in a town called Pitigorsk, and there, during one of the soirees, he had an unfortunate encounter with a man called Martynov. There is no true account as to what actually happened and what led to the duel between the two, but some offense was caused and the duel was set. It needs to be mentioned here that Lermontov is remembered by his contemporaries quite differently. Some describe him as a good-natured man with bright eyes and jokes all around. Others, and quite a few of them, found something almost demonic in him, dark eyes and a whole disposition. It looks like Lermontov could be a very unpleasant man, prickly and mordant, cruel at times and unwilling to relent. I'm gonna link a YouTube video where a wonderful Russian historian, she talks about Lermontov and she cites accounts of Lermontov's contemporaries where they describe him. So if you're interested in a more deeper dive into Lermontov's character, all the power to you. When it comes to the duel specifically, Martynov claims that Lermontov was provoking him at every occasion with jokes, jibes and taunts and wouldn't listen to reason, so they had no other choice but to duel. Others suggest that it might have been because they were trying to court the same woman. Some claim that the conflict between the two was brewing for years. Others suggest that Martynov was egged on quite a bit. And the best conspiracy theory is that Nikolai I actually put a hit on Lermontov's head. Regardless, 27th of July 1841, the duel took place at the bottom of the Mount Mashuk during the storm. Lermontov and their seconds really didn't believe the duel to be serious. To the last moment, Lermontov was squeaking and needling Martynov, who shot him straight in the chest, killing him. The duel to this day remains a little bit of a mystery because the investigation revealed quite a few inconsistencies between the statements of Martynov and their seconds. For instance, apparently they left Lermontov's body on the site for like 6 hours, potentially hoping that it would be ruled like a hit and run. And maybe that's because Martynov shot Lermontov before he was supposed to, according to the dueling code, making it a murder and not the fun kind dueling murder. But at the end of the day, that was the end of the 27-year-old Lermontov. Nikolai I said it best. "Gentlemen, we have received news that the one who could replace Pushkin for us has been killed." That is, after, in private, he said, "To a dog, the dog's death." Ish. But even if this young man had a terrible reputation, was considered by many to be petty and obnoxious, and really, it just feels like he hasn't had the time to grow up and mature just yet. He died at 27, for God's sakes. Nothing really diminishes his literary talent. Somehow his poems revealed a completely different side to him. Lermontov left beautiful poetry and one prosaic novel, Hero of Our Time, that we're going to be talking about today. This is all of it, by the way. If you want a shorter novel, this even has a few poems in here, so it's even shorter than this. The novel was first published in Отечественные записки bit by bit in the period of 1838 through 1840, and then as a completed novel in 1840. The book is almost entirely inspired by Lermontov's time in the Caucasus Mountains. For instance, the story Tamань depicts Lermontov's first arrival in the Caucasus. The novel itself consists of 5 stories that are connected by the protagonist Grigory Pechorin. Let's recap. The narrator, an unnamed officer, travels from Tbilisi to Vladikavkaz, and on the road he meets a captain called Maxim Maximych, with whom they go through part of the journey together. Maxim Maximych tells him a story from his past about a man called Pechorin, with whom they've spent quite a bit of time together in a fortress somewhere. Pechorin, who's been condemned to the fortress for participating in a duel, decides to steal a daughter of a local chief with the help of her brother, whom he helps to steal a noble steed from a man called Kazbich, who also had the eyes on a girl. You with me? Azamat, the brother, brings Bella, the girl, to Pechorin and runs off with the horse. The proud Bella first pines in her confinement, rejecting all attention and gifts that Pechorin bestows upon her, but he eventually wears her down and they start living together. Sometime later, Maxim Maximych starts noticing that Pechorin grows colder towards Bella, and that hurts her quite a bit. Pechorin says that he does love Bella, but he has a terrible character and he's growing bored of her. Maxim Maximych tries to cheer Bella up and takes her for a walk on the fortress wall. That's where Kazbich sees her. A few days later, when Pechorin and Maxim Maximych are out for a hunt, Kazbich kidnaps Bella and stabs her in the stomach when Pechorin catches up to them. Bella dies a few days later and Pechorin leaves the fortress. In Vladikavkaz, the narrator runs into Maxim Maximych once again, and they learn that Pechorin is also there. Maxim Maximych is quite excited to see his old friend, but Pechorin is cold and distant, which pains and hurts Maxim Maximych to the core. Pechorin leaves, and Maxim Maximych bitterly gives the narrator some of Pechorin's old papers. In the foreword to the second part, the narrator informs us of Pechorin's death on the route from Persia, and that gives him some moral right to publish some of Pechorin's diaries. In Tamань, a young Pechorin arrives in a small village called Tamань to stay for the night. The only house available to him is a dark house. There is a blind boy, an old woman, and a beautiful girl. Pechorin thinks this could be an interesting adventure with the girl, but as it turns out, he stumbled into the business of honest smugglers, and the girl almost drowns him for attempting to expose them. In Princess Mary, Pechorin arrives in Pitigorsk, a mineral spa resort. People there bore him, so he decides to play a prank on a fellow called Grushnitsky, whom he doesn't like. Pechorin starts to pursue a Princess Mary in whom Grushnitsky is interested as well. At the same time, Pechorin runs into an old flame of his, a woman called Vera, who's now married to a different man, and Pechorin starts an affair with her. Pechorin eventually wins Mary's favor, which pisses Grushnitsky off quite a bit, and that leads to the duel between the two where Pechorin kills Grushnitsky. Pechorin then confesses to Mary that he's been playing her all along and leaves her. This whole business with Mary and Grushnitsky exposes Vera's affair to her husband, and that ruins her as well. And for participating in the duel, Pechorin is sent to the fortress where he gets to meet Maxim Maximych. In Fatalist, Pechorin takes a bet against a Serb called Vulic, who believes in fate and decides to prove it. Vulic claims that if he's not meant to die, then he can try and shoot himself and it won't work. He then takes a pistol off the wall, pulls the trigger, but it comes out blank. Then he shoots at the wall and the bullet goes into the wall. Thus, he somehow won this terrible game of Russian roulette and has proven that fate is real. Pechorin, however, believes that he sees a mark of death on Vulic's face and is proven correct when later that night Vulic is killed by a random Cossack. Pechorin then decides to test the fate himself and helps to apprehend the Cossack, surviving an impossible stunt himself, thus proving that the fate might actually be real. Discussions of Hero of Our Time normally start with the structure, composition, and genre. When I talked about Eugene Onegin, the first novel in Russian literature, I made the claim that Eugene Onegin does not fit the definition of the novel 100%, and that the first actual novel in Russian literature was Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol. And in doing that, I've intentionally omitted the Hero of Our Time, that is also labeled a novel, but does not fit the definition. When you look at the structure of Hero, it consists of 5 novellas and/or short stories that are all interconnected by the protagonist of Pechorin. In Russian literary studies, it's perfectly acceptable, if not expected, for you not to call them chapters, but stories or novellas. And that's perfectly understandable because almost all of them stand on their own and can be read separately, except for maybe Maxim Maximych, which is that connecting tissue / compositional element that ties it all together. Kinda. From the structure and compositional point, I also need to mention the order of these stories. The researchers indicate the intentionality of this order as it differs from the chronological order. This is the order, and this is the chronological order. Researchers now argue that the order of the stories works, actually, as it allows for a deeper exploration of Pechorin's character. We first get the third-hand description of him. Maxim Maximych tells about Pechorin to the narrator. Then the narrator actually gets to see Pechorin himself, and then we get Pechorin's diaries and Pechorin's POV. So we essentially start from the outside going in. Since all of the lecturers I've listened to argue this, I'm not going to sit here and disagree. What is true regardless is that having multiple POVs does allow for a more multifaceted view of the character. I'm simply not convinced that Lermontov had this grand plan in mind. Lermontov's life in general is shrouded in mystery, and that extends to his writing as well, so it is unclear if he wrote these stories with the intention of combining them into a novel. Earlier in life, he attempted a novel called Princess Legavskaya that featured a proto-Pechorin, but Princess Mary is not a rewrite of that novel, and even the character of Pechorin is not the same that we know. So it is perfectly possible that Lermontov first wrote a number of short stories and then combined them into a novel by adding this connective tissue in Maxim Maximych and some addendums made by the narrator. Tamань probably stands out most tonally, but also structurally an interesting choice. We've just learned of Pechorin's death and then instantly presented with the youngest Pechorin we'll get to see. So if you're not happy with consistency of the novel, I'm right there with you. We can chalk it up to the author's youth and inexperience, or simply lower on standards and call them a series of short stories instead of a novel. That probably works best for me. A few other notes on the genre and style. Hero represents a shift from romanticism that we saw in Lermontov's poems to realism. This change is most obvious in Tamань. The story starts according to the rules of Romanticism. Protagonist arrives in the middle of nowhere in the night. The place that he's supposed to stay in, the locals call it dark. There is a beautiful girl that he compares to a mermaid. So all signs point to something mysterious, if not demonic. The scenery is reminiscent of Gothic fiction, but then the rules change. The mysteriousness of the location and the girl is explained by the trivial dealings of honest smugglers and not something supernatural, and the protagonist does not get a love affair out of his Undine, but instead has all of his belongings stolen. It is almost like a deconstruction of the genre, really. Another thing here is that Lermontov makes an attempt at a psychological novel, the type that's gonna haunt Russian literature for decades afterwards. In Princess Mary and Fatalist, we are privy to Pechorin's innermost thoughts, his soul-searchings, he's looking for his raison d'être, and he's also analyzing people around him. Pechorin is using other people in his experiments to entertain himself, but he's also testing the limits of what he cannot do, and morals play a terrifyingly small part in his thought process. In those moments, he reminded me a little bit of Raskolnikov, who also believes himself to be above others, and in some ways even goes further in his premeditated murder. But in other ways, Pechorin surpasses Raskolnikov because he feels very little guilt in his murder of Grushnitsky. He says in that moment, finita la commedia, confirming that it's still a game that he started when he started pursuing Princess Mary, and all of these people around him are simply puppets or secondary characters at best in this spectacle of Pechorin's life. Do we call it like a main character syndrome or something? But these thoughts of Pechorin, regardless of their morals, make for a beautiful first attempt at a psychological novel in Russian literature, and that's probably why Leo Tolstoy later said, "If that boy had lived, neither I nor Dostoevsky would have been needed. It was he who had this eternal, powerful search for truth. It's such a great pity that he died so young. What powers that man had? What could he do? He started right away having that power. He doesn't have any jokes. Jokes are not difficult to write, but every word of his was the word of a man who had power." So let us talk about the character of Pechorin then. Quite a controversial figure, wouldn't you agree? When the first readers read the novel, there was quite a bit of outrage. How dare he call such a man a hero of our time? Our favorite Tsar, Nikolai I, who sent Lermontov to the Caucasus, was quite disappointed by the novel. He was excited when he read the first part and disappointed by the second because he believed that it was Maxim Maximych who was going to be the hero of our time. I read The Hero to the end and find the second part disgusting, quite worthy of Bain and fashion. This is the same exaggerated depiction of despicable characters that we find in current foreign novels. So I repeat that, in my opinion, this is a pathetic book that reveals the great depravity of the writer. The captain's character is well mapped out. When I started the story, I hoped and rejoiced that he would probably be the hero of our time, because there are many more real people in this class than among those who are usually called that. Mr. Lermontov was unable to bring this noble and simple character to life and replaces him with these unsuitable, very unattractive personalities who, if they existed, should have been left aside as not to arouse disgust. But, well, Maxim Maximych as a character has a certain appeal. For example, his capacity for feeling, that Lermontov notes as well. Yes, the captain too, for simple hearts feel the beauty and the majesty of nature 100 times more keenly than we do. Rapturous tellers of stories, spoken or written. And that's why Pechorin's rejection hurts him so much, because he can feel much more deeply than a complicated soul like Pechorin can, but there is a slight issue. You cannot write a novel about Maxim Maximych, because the most interesting thing, the only thing worthy of note in his life, was Pechorin. We sat in silence. What was there to say? He had already told me all that was interesting about himself, and I had nothing to tell him. That's what the traveling officer says about him when they reconnect, after Maxim Maximych had already told him the story of Bella. So, our hero is Pechorin. We need to note here that hero has multiple definitions. It can be a man of great courage and achievements in that Greek myth type of situation, which Pechorin isn't. It can be simply the main character of a piece of fiction, which Pechorin is, but Russian also has the definition of a hero as a man who exemplifies the qualities and the character traits of his generation. And that's what Lermontov highlights in the foreword to the second edition of the novel. Lermontov at that point had already heard the feedback and wasn't happy about it, especially the one that implied that Pechorin is modeled after Lermontov himself. The present book recently had the misfortune of being taken literally by some readers and even some magazines. Some were frightfully offended, in all seriousness, at being given a man as immoral as the hero of our time for a model. Others delicately hinted that the author had drawn portraits of himself and his acquaintances. A threadbare witticism. But apparently Russia is so constituted that however science may progress in every other respect, she is unable to get rid of absurdities like this. With us, the most fantastic of fairy tales has hardly a chance of escaping criticism as attempted a libel. A hero of our time, my dear sirs, is indeed a portrait, but not of one man. It is a portrait built up of our generation's vices in full bloom. You will again tell me that a human being cannot be so wicked, and I shall reply that if you can believe in the existence of all of the villains of tragedy and romance, why should you not believe that there was a Pechorin? If you could admire far more terrifying and repulsive types, why are you not more merciful to this character, even if it is fictitious? Is it not because there is more truth in it than you might wish? So according to Lermontov himself, he combined all of the vices of his generation into one character, and Pechorin emerged. Lermontov's generation was a troubled one, the post-Decembrist generation stuck in Nikolai I's reactionary Russia, this brilliant man that had no avenue to apply their talents to, which they presumably had, and the only outlet allowed was military. So in literature we normally see them as either these idle men that muddle through life without any true achievements, or they go into military service. In the literary studies, they were called the Superfluous man type. The title was retroactively applied to some of the early 19th century characters, for instance, Trotsky in Walk from Wit, Eugene Onegin in Eugene Onegin, Pechorin, Oblomov in Oblomov, and some of Turgenev's characters. Current-day studies try to move away from this characterization because while these characters do have things in common, but bulking them together like this moves our attention away from what makes them different, and that's always the most interesting bit. Having said that, we still need to look at the similarities between Eugene Onegin and Pechorin, as this influence is unmistakable. First of all, let's say that Lermontov isn't shying away from the connection of his book to Pushkin's. He even fully cites a passage here. The mind's reflection coolly noted the bitter insights of the heart. Pechorin is also named, just like Onegin was, after a river, an obvious nod to Pushkin. Eugene Onegin was a book that it's hard to underplay the influence of. Lermontov was highly inspired by Pushkin, and they both were highly inspired by Lord Byron and his Byronic hero, so we see these echoes in Hero of Our Time, although there are obviously differences as well. Pechorin and Onegin have a lot in common. Lermontov either intentionally gives Pechorin a characterization that's eerily similar to that of Onegin, or it was truly a portrait of a man of that epoch. This self-description by Pechorin in Bella is quite similar to how we meet Eugene Onegin in the first chapter of Pushkin's book. A young man, idle, brilliant, and beloved by society and women, but bored of his skull of it all. Their paths diverge when they leave the glamour of the capital. Eugene Onegin goes into the countryside to become a landowner, and Pechorin goes south to the Caucasus into military service. Plot-wise, however, their stories are very similar once again. Try to think of what you remember of Eugene Onegin, and let's look at Princess Mary. Pechorin is obviously a reflection of Onegin. Mary plays two parts, of a young Tatiana and Olga. Her falling in love with Pechorin and his subsequent rejection is Tatiana's story with Onegin and his rebuttal of her. But Mary also plays the role of Olga in the conflict between Pechorin and Grushnitsky, down to Pechorin stealing a dance from Grushnitsky, just like Eugene Onegin did to Lensky. The character of Lenski is split into two. It's both Grushnitsky and Werner. Werner takes the romantic, poetic side, and Grushnitsky takes the competitive side that actually leads to the duel with the same result. Pechorin kills Grushnitsky, just like Onegin killed Lenski. And Pechorin's relationship with Vera is actually Onegin's attempt at pursuing a married Tatiana, who's also married to a man whom she doesn't love. If you wanted Tatiana to get together with Onegin in the end, look at Vera's relationship with Pechorin and see how well that worked out for her. The parallels are obviously not 1-1, the events move around a little bit, but it's all there. But here's the kicker. For all of the similarities, the thing that makes these stories different is the character of Pechorin. Onegin's characterization is done almost entirely through the eyes of the author narrator, who claims to be his friend, but we never get to peek behind the curtain, so to speak, and see Onegin's thoughts. He barely even speaks beyond his refusal of Tatiana and his letter to her. What Lermontov does is that he gives us multiple points of view of Pechorin. Bella is told from the point of view of Pechorin's friend, Maxim Maximych. In Maxim Maximych, the narrator gets to see Pechorin, and the three stories, Tamань, Princess Mary, and The Fatalist, are done entirely in Pechorin's POV. And that last one is crucial, as seen the thought process of Pechorin. Why he decides to pursue Princess Mary when he's not truly interested. Why he goes Grushnitsky. What he thinks and feels the night before the duel. Pechorin does a lot of self-reflection, especially in Princess Mary. He's in constant conversation with himself, interrogating his actions, motives, and potential consequences. It doesn't stop him from hurting others, but his actions are logically consistent, and he's also willing to face the consequences of his actions, both in terms of his own guilt and other people's judgments. That's the one thing that creates the divide between him and Werner. The doctor is unable to bear the weight of the responsibility for the role that he played in Grushnitsky's death. Both Grushnitsky and Werner, incidentally, act as reflections or doubles of Pechorin. Grushnitsky is a parody one. He wants to be as aloof, smooth, and dandy as Pechorin, but he's not intelligent enough or even honorable enough, so it all becomes an act without sustenance. That's why Grushnitsky agrees to such a dishonesty as loading only his gun during the duel with Pechorin, something for all of his faults I cannot see Pechorin doing. Dr. Werner appears to be a Pechorin type. He's just as introspective and as intelligent. The residents of the spa resort called him Mephistopheles for this image that he presents to the outside world. But Werner is also modeled after a different Goethe character, Werther. And so he has this romantic and sensitive side to him that actually does not allow him to brush off Grushnitsky's death, no matter how inevitable or justified it was. Pechorin is much more than his doubles. He's complex. He's intelligent, he's introspective, he's incredibly adept at reading people and getting what he wants from them. He knows the human psychology pretty well, he simply uses it for evil. If you look at his interactions with Bella, they're incredibly manipulative. This is victim blaming and gaslighting 101, and we know this to be effective, just morally questionable at best. And his tactics do work, and Bella gives herself to him. Same with Princess Mary. He uses tactics that work to get the attentions of the young girl. First getting in her way and ignoring her, then performing a knight in shining armor routine to win her favor, and later opening up to her on an emotional level at the right moment to seal the deal, even if the confession is likely fake. I don't know what pickup artists teach these days, but this all seems to have worked in the era before feminism. Pushkin said it first, after all. The less we love a woman woo her, the more disposed to us she gets, and thus more surely we undo her and catch her in her tempting nets. Pechorin's treatment of women is abhorrent in general. Even Vera, for whom he seems to have some genuine feelings, he still doesn't let the heart take over his mind, and he pushes those rush of feelings away. He weeps like a child when he cannot catch up to her to say goodbye, but then rationalizes it all away by frayed nerves, a sleepless night, and an empty stomach. None of these stories end well. Bella dies, Princess Mary is hurt and hates him, Vera is ruined. And it does hurt Pechorin on some level, no matter the amount of rationalization that he does. But Pechorin is the creator of his own misfortune and unhappiness if he's so unwilling to let some feeling enter his heart. He says that anything that he tries in life leaves him unhappy and unsatisfied. Women, studies, wars, it all leaves him bored. That's what we see in Princess Mary, his attempt at entertaining himself by playing this spectacle with Princess Mary and Grushnitsky in hope of feeling something. Ironically, he does. He starts developing feelings for Princess Mary, he simply pushes them away, and the night before the duel with Grushnitsky is the most emotionally charged night of his life. And these feelings and how he deals with them, that's what's interesting. His actions are despicable more often than not, and I'm not undisturbed by them. I've read the book twice for this video. On the first read, I was kind of raging about the Pechorin's treatment of women. On the second read, I was much more chill, so I could talk about it. Pechorin is a complete bastard, and I'm not saying that he's somehow misunderstood. The thing is, though, I think that Lermontov knows what his character is and all of his flaws. He's not trying to excuse them. He simply wants to explore the complexities of such a character. Pechorin is not a mustache-twirling villain. He's much more introspective and much more complex than that. He's simply a type of person that is interesting to read a book about, but you would never want to meet such a person in real life. The problem, I think, comes in when researchers and some part of the audience take the better qualities of Pechorin and make a case that it somehow excuses some of his behavior. There is an argument out there, for example, that Pechorin has a lot of empathy in him because when Maxim Maximych brings up Bella, Pechorin blushes, and that somehow indicates that he's deeply moved by what happened to her. Well, I believe that the incident with Bella didn't leave Pechorin completely unmoved. I don't think it requires a lot of empathy here. The woman died because of him. You would need to be a complete sociopath not to feel anything here. But it doesn't take away from the intentionality of Pechorin's actions up to that point that led to this point. Some part of the audience also likes to treat Pechorin as a misunderstood bad boy in that I can change him type of way, which he also isn't. Pechorin knows his flaws, he is cognizant of his character and the effect that he has on people. I know only that if I cause unhappiness to others, I myself am no less unhappy. I realize this is poor consolation for them, but the fact remains that it is so. Yet it doesn't change his behavior, so okay. And also, while seemingly he's willing to accept the responsibility for his actions, there are also passages like this where he believes he's to be pitied. I don't know whether I'm a fool or scoundrel, but the fact is that I'm to be pitied as much, if not more than she. So he both knows the part he plays in this, but he also implies that there are other forces at play. And maybe that's because Pechorin assigns some of his less stellar actions to fate. This motif of predisposition and destiny appears throughout the book. Pechorin is actually quite good at predicting his own fate, like his own death, for example, or the outcome of his conflict with Grushnitsky. But the thesis statement obviously appears in the last story, Fatalist. In Fatalist, the question of destiny is presented quite plainly in this game of Russian roulette, but also at the same time, Pechorin, who bets against the existence of destiny, sees something in Vulich that suggests that destiny might just be real. Researchers like to point to destiny as it is presented in Islam and Christianity and how it all ties back to individual action and choice. I'm not touching that, not only because I do not know anything about Islam, and what I know of Christianity is that it's incredibly wishy-washy when it comes to destiny and individual choice. So I'm not touching this bucket of Lermontov and Islam, although it's out there. But coming back to the book, it seems that both times fate seems to exist. Vulich is meant to die, so he does. Pechorin isn't, so he doesn't. What I want you to take a look at is the very end, where Pechorin tells this story to Maxim Maximych, and Maxim Maximych says this. Yes, I'm sorry for the poor chap. Why the devil did he stop to talk to with a drunk at night? But I suppose that was his destiny. This line suggests both that the destiny exists and Vulich had no means of changing it, but at the same time implies some level of control in him speaking or not speaking to his future murderer. But there is also a line like this. By the way, these Asiatic pistol cocks often misfire if they are poorly oiled or if you don't press hard enough with your finger. This here suggests that Vulich, in that moment when he took the pistol, was in full control of his fate if he knew not to press too hard. So, does destiny exist or not? Pechorin questions if fate has played a part in this and that event throughout the book. Even in Fatalist, having done his test, he does not come out with a clear answer. After all this, how could one possibly avoid becoming a fatalist? But who knows for certain whether he's convinced of anything or not? And how often we mistake a deception of senses or an error of reason for conviction. I prefer to doubt everything. Such a disposition does not preclude a resolute character. On the contrary, as far as I'm concerned, I always advance more boldly when I do not know what is awaiting me. After all, nothing worse than death can happen, and death you cannot escape. Interestingly, if we look at the composition of the novel and tie it back to fate, the 3 stories where Pechorin is in mortal danger occur after we have learned that he died on the road to Persia years later. So we know that the Undine is not going to drown him, Grushnitsky is not going to shoot him, and the Cossack doesn't pose any danger. So we, in that moment, as readers, become this all-knowing being, looking at Pechorin and his actions, knowing his destiny when he doesn't. This, however, isn't enough for us to say that we know everything about Pechorin. For all of his introspection, for all of the hints and clues, Pechorin remains a mystery to us to the end, and one would assume to himself as well. Igor Zuhikh in his paper proposes the entirety of Pechorin's character is written not as an answer but as a question. Just like he's constantly questioning himself, we as readers are constantly trying to understand him. So maybe it's okay that we never get the answer to the mystery of Pechorin. Погиб поэт, невольник чести, полокровавленный молвой. I read The Death of the Poet as I was prepping. And it's quite powerful, really, because I don't know what's in here, but there's something in there about the rhythm of it all, but also like the sound of it, the consonants and everything. It feels like a drum almost, because it's incredibly accusatory towards everybody, really. And so, especially these last 16 lines. А вы, надменные потомки известной подлости прославленных отцов, пятою рабскую поправшие обломки игрой счастья обиженных рабов. Вы жадной толпой, стоящие у трона, свободы гения, славы палачи, таитесь вы под сенью закона, пред вами суд и правда, все молчи. Но есть и Божий суд на перстнике разврата, есть грозный суд, он ждет, он недоступен воину злата, и мысли и дела он знает наперед. Тогда напрасно вы прибегнете к злословию, оно вам не поможет вновь, и вы не смолите всей вашей черной кровью поэта праведную кровь. I feel something when I read this, especially in Russian. The English translation is not perfect. At least I haven't found the perfect one, really. But yeah, there is something in here that's just rousing. Not arousing, but rousing. Although, to each their own.